And Roy Bean is sort of a clown that later in life, was a pioneer for celebrities who were famous only for being celebrities. So he's a modern creation in a lot of ways. He's a modern man in that way, coming out of this frontier. And yet he is the symbol of the frontier for a lot of people. This judge who went his own way because that's what the circumstances required, and that's how he was going to bring peace and law and stability. And that's all horseshit. I mean, he brought more crime and disorder and chicanery to his small town even later in life than he ever supplied law and order. And earlier in life, he was raising hell from Mexico to California and everywhere in between. So, and those are the interesting stories to me. In the dust where legends roam, for brave souls they call it home. Against the tide, the desert sinks. Joe Pappalardo meets the West takes wing. Together we stand against the storm. Heroes rise, a new world born. Blazing sun, a showdown's near. With grit and glory, we have no fear. The untamed wild, with a roaring quest. Joe Pappalardo against the West.
Brother,
I'm good. How are you, man?
Good, man. It's good to see you. I am pumped about your new book, Four Against the West, and I wanted to just chat with you about that for a little bit. My first question is did this sort of come out of Red Sky Morning?
In a weird way, it did. One of my Rangers in Company F, which is the Ranger company I profiled, when they were running around in the late 1800s, he was young during that book. And later in his life, and later in Roy Bean's life, they tangle over an illegal championship boxing match that Roy Bean's hosting on a sandbar in between the United States and Mexico. And it's illegal. Boxing is at that point illegal in both nations. So he devised this way out of the gym to have the boxing match still go on. He can make a buck out of it and get some infamy. So it's a gold star day for old Roy. But yeah, so I thought this is my kind of anti-hero. Like, he's a Texas legend, sort of second tier, sort of dubious reputation, iconoclastic. What did he really do? What is his story? And I found him, and then I also found his three brothers, and I thought, do a quadruple biography and candy cane their experiences together, and you've got a pretty good book that really covers everything about the Old West, from the Santa Fe Trail to California to New Mexico, the Civil War, Mexican-American War, all these great scenes, all these great settings. How could you go wrong? So I just sort of dove in and went for all four of them. And it turns out that Roy pops up in their lives a lot. So there was a good narrative flow through, not to his brother's benefit usually, but he would show up nonetheless. So
one of the things I really like is that, Judge Roy Bean, like a lot of things you and I have talked about, Judge Roy Bean is sort of the entryway for a lot of people. He's the one I knew about.
All right, shut up and sit down.
Well, good morning, Sonny.
Good morning, Judge.
You mind just stepping around here, please, Sonny? Sonny boy, you was brought in here for borrowing another fellow's horse without him knowing it. Now it's my duty as the law of this fair city to pass judgment and speak my verdict. Sonny, time will pass, the seasons will come and go. Summer with its shimmering heat waves and the baked horizon and fall. with a yellow harvest moon, and the hills all turning golden under the sinking sun. And then winter, with a biting, whining wind, and the land all mantled over white with snow. And then spring again. Spring with the green grass blowing gently in the breeze, and heaps of sweet wildflowers on top of every hill. But you won't be here to see none of it, because the order is court right now, that you'll be took out of here up on that hill and be hanged by the neck till you're dead, dead, dead. Now get him out of here.
He's the, like, seeing that it was about, besides the point that you wrote it, seeing that it was about him, I was like, okay, I recognize that name. I've seen a few Westerns that featured his mythology. I want to learn more. But once you dive in, it like the story of his brothers provides something that's even more substantial.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the hook, but his brothers are, at least two of them are very, you could argue, and you would win probably, more historically significant than he is. The other brother did more locally and was more of a success and a failure in Missouri, not nearly as swashbuckling, and he got in his share of adventures too, but compared to the other guys, he's sort of the one who stayed behind. The other two were leading men of their times. One was the first mayor of American San Diego. The other one was the first sheriff in Doña Ana County in New Mexico, and they operated saloons and all these places. I mean, they were militia leaders. They were men of stature, right? And during times of tremendous change, we're talking about the Civil War, or the settlement of California under American hands, or even the Santa Fe Trail and all the money that brought in the United States, stabilized the whole economy. I mean, these were pivotal people doing important things. And Roy Bean is sort of a clown that later in life, was a pioneer for celebrities who were famous only for being celebrities. So he's a modern creation in a lot of ways. He's a modern man in that way, coming out of this frontier. And yet he is the symbol of the frontier for a lot of people. That this judge who went his own way because that's what the circumstances required, and that's how he was going to bring peace and law and stability. And that's all horseshit. I mean, he brought more crime and disorder and chicanery to his small town even later in life than he ever supplied law and order. And earlier in life, he was raising hell from Mexico to California and everywhere in between. So, and those are the interesting stories to me. Was not his role as a judge later in life, but his adventures earlier in life, and what made him into that creature that we all know later in life, and why he wanted to stick it to the man, where that impulse came from, and and everything from his mail order divorce scheme, makes more sense when you see what happened in his marriage, right? I mean, there's a lot that goes into it when you look at his biography as a young man going forward, instead of here's this larger than life figure, let's try and support that figure with all these tall tales. Not to say that the previous biographers had tall tales, but the conventional wisdom about Roy Bean is usually not accurate. And it's more the fault of the movie than it is anything that was written about him, to be honest.
I'm always interested in this, is like in Westerns in particular, this idea of like the anti-hero, because I feel like it's a specific version of the anti-hero. It's obviously specifically American, but it's also American in the sense that, like, I mean, you have so many of these like outlaws who become lawmen, and they're like, there's this constant collision between like good and bad, and the poles are just flopping back and forth. So, what is it about? What is it about that whole time period that draws us in to that sort of contradictory relationship?
I mean, the romantic way would be to say something about it's the, fighting for the soul of the nation or something. But, it's just living living in those times, your individual choices do make a bigger difference. They do echo because there's so much in transition. Because it's a brand new city. When you're the first mayor, you set the template. You're part of something that's bigger just by virtue of you being there. And the beans have a knack for being there and being the ones who are involved in things, right? I mean, that is a skill all unto itself, and one that all four of them actually shared. So I'm not taking anything away from individual choice. I'm actually going the opposite direction. Individual choice does make a difference when you're talking about capital H history and manifest destiny and the whole idea that there's an inevitable spread. It didn't seem inevitable to the people who were involved in it. Not the people who were there, not the people who were going, not the people who ultimately wound up holding the reins of power at the end. I mean, it's a dynamic time. So how could you go wrong? It's a violent time, yes. There's a lot of adventure involved, but the real kick of it is that the things that individuals did actually made a difference. And if you chose one way over the other, it altered the flow of history, even just a little bit. Or you got carried away. More often than not, you get carried away by the flow of history. And that's interesting, too. You have an ambition that hits reality, and then you get swept up in it. That's just great. That's a great narrative and a humanizing way of seeing the events of the time. Taking it from a character-driven standpoint rather than an academic or a 20,000-foot view. I like to try and ground it in the experiences of people, and that way you kind of experience it with them, and you would actually learn more rather than reading something that's more academic or dry or something more sweeping or less focused, however you want to put it. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of books like that too, and they're good, and I rely on them. Do not get me wrong. I'm not putting them down, but this is a different experience.
What sort of on the ground reporting did you do for this?
Did I go? I went to the old railroad camp ruins with an archaeological team at the Eagle Pass. That was really cool. Got some good pictures there. And there's still, the remains of saloons and they're saloons because there's broken beer bottles all stretched, and they weren't. It's just an amazing sight, and the size of these camps and the location of the camp and where his saloon was. It had to be there or a place just like it. So functionally, you're standing in Roy Bean's famous saloon where he first was served as the Justice of the Peace, and and if it's not that one, it's one of those other buildings. But this is the one with all the beer bottles behind it. So so that was all cool just for the ambiance. But going to New Mexico yielded the best stuff for sure. I can do a lot from this office, right? A lot. I am accessing newspapers that would take a conventional, a generation ago would take 5-10 years of traveling to places and reading newspaper archives and still not knowing that you're going to catch something. I can do that in a database just like that. So it's already an unfair advantage, but even with all of that, it's the things that are locked away somewhere in a print copy, a hard copy, that always seems to deliver the best stuff. And in this case, going to New Mexico and going to the university library in El Paso, and it's in Mesilla, and they had a amazing interview with Sam Bean, one of the four brothers, and it was sort of in the form of a sort of novelized. It was never published. It was a historian who worked there. She was very much into the Old West and knew Sam Bean really well, had a bunch of interviews with him, had big direct quotes from him. And then like these scenes that were, you don't know if they're fictionalized or if he told her that happened. And so I couldn't include those in there. And but just the Sam Bean pull quotes were extensive. And he was talking about his relationship with his brother, and he was talking about times in his life and how he felt about slavery. And there it was, and the schism that they had. And he mentions that Roy came back and they visited with each other at the end of their lives after their big falling out. So that's all huge. How could I even start writing the book without knowing that was even there? is how I think about it now. What a moron I was to not know that was there and still sell a book to a publishing company without that kind of emotional ending, or not emotional, but well, it is emotional. Why not? I mean, it's the personal side of the story, the brothers falling out and getting back together. And I didn't really have that when I went into it. So, I didn't have an ending. It should have been terrifying, but going to places you always find it. I don't know. One day I won't, and then we'll have a different discussion. But the next book I'm doing, the same thing happened. I went to Austin and went to the library and found an old pay. You pay the guy, he mails it to you, kind of a book. It's published, self-published of the time in the 20s, 1927. One of the only copies around. You can't find the thing, and it has everything I'm looking for. And it's like, better to be lucky than smart, but you gotta go and look. You can't just rely on the computer, as helpful as it is. And the computer does help me find these things and leads to them, but you don't know what's in them until you crack the pages open. You just don't. And that's cool. I like that part. I always like that part.
Yeah, you've been doing that a while too. I mean, like from your first days in Mexico in a proper newsroom, and then you were in New York. Was it were you at Wall Street? You weren't at Wall Street during your New York Times?
No, I was at the Associated Press in New York for a while.
Associated
the
Press.
News and Information Research Center, which is a whole other thing. And then I was at Popper Mechanics for 7 years. That's where and Smithsonian. I was in DC for a while too, doing stuff. But I mean, honestly, the daily journalism thing, I do try to apply a lot of that to the book writing as much as possible. Too much so. I try to break away from it a little bit more and play to the strengths of what books should do, and get away from the strictly magazine style writing. So I'm still playing around with it, but the basics of covering people, narrative arc, telling the stories, making sure the readers are following along, and just the reporting is always the answer. That's what I got from daily journalism. I apply to books all the time. Area of town named after him, Beantown. He operated a pretty infamous saloon on the outskirts. People call it a slum. It was pretty bad, and he didn't do much to make it better. And they bought him out so that he would leave, essentially. And he started off as a squatter there and tricked some poor woman into marrying him. I mean, he was a real piece of work. But all this comes out without a lot of detail, like a timeline. He was there for 10 years or something like that. So you have a couple of months worth of material. He did more than that, right? So you start really looking, what was the neighborhood like? What was the history of that section of town? All right, he was, camped out here. Who owned that? What was that like? All right, so he was positioned here. We knew he went into the town square. What was that like? Oh, there was a couple different town squares, but they all had the chili con carne women who had just invented the chili queens, they call them. So this brand new dish that was going to go coast to coast is being invented. So you start realizing you can lean into the scenes where you knew he walked through to get a little narrative juice going, right? So it's a trick, but it's also a way to keep readers invested in a part of the story that is maybe not the one that the historians are going to focus on. He doesn't shoot anyone. He doesn't con anyone. He doesn't get a job. He's just there. And he's, selling wood that he's cutting down illegally from someone. Someone hired him to be a watchman to stop people from cutting down wood. So he does that and starts cutting down wood. And then if he catches anyone, even if they have permission from the owner, he takes their wood and sells it too. So, he does stuff like that. So we kind of know what he's up to, but so you can paint that picture of him doing that today. And then at night he's out drinking, and then he's with the, chili queens, and, it's just, so you have to look at the maps to make sure that makes sense. And it does. Just because he said it doesn't mean he did it. So you have to look at the route from where he was squatting to where the downtown was, and where you need a horse. Like, you get all this stuff together, and you have enough to get to his next known sort of caper or next big step, which would be marriage in this case. And divorce.
of his story that you read, how much of like his mythology did you have to cut away as either I can't say for sure that happened, or I know for sure this didn't happen?
The if I didn't know for sure, it didn't go in. Um, Most of the biographers have done a good job of the documented stuff.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, it was pretty easy. It, you know, if you start from the standpoint that you can't trust anything Roy says. So if you trust everyone else over Roy, including public records and if Roy tells his brothers things, or Roy tells newspaper reporters things, and they don't make it necessarily true, right? So you start thinking, why did he say that? What was he doing? What was the point of that? How does it aggrandize him at this point in his life? Why is he saying it? Not what he's saying, but why he's saying it. But the verifiable stuff is good enough. The stuff that I found that the other guys didn't mention, everyone mentions his rope burn that he comes back from California, which is an apparent attempted lynching that he would never talk about. So you see him with the scarves and kerchiefs and stuff, and he's always buttoned up and all this. But when you look in the newspaper archives, we have no idea where that came from, what that's about. But the newspapers are very clear that someone shot him when he came into a store raging drunk, yelling and threatening, and someone just shot him. And there were no repercussions. In the newspaper article, a follow-up, before they knew he was going to live or die, they said, basically he was a jerk and had it coming. Like that, the tone of the article, in no uncertain terms. I wish I had it right here so I could just read it to you. It's like scathing. It basically, and he was just persona non grata there. And that doesn't make it into anything. Like that, those two articles are obscure, but they tell me a lot. And that was not too long before he left. So, if the rope story, if the lynching story is true or not, we don't know what that is. We know that he wasn't welcome there through being shot and the immediate media reaction. There was a big segment of the society that, like everywhere else, he was not welcome. And that fits his pattern too. I mean, he got thrown out of Mexico, thrown out of Chihuahua, got thrown out of New Mexico, got thrown out of San Gabriel. I mean, the guy wore out his welcome, and they tried to throw him out of Langtree a couple of times, the locals, but he always persevered.
Of the four brothers, like after everything you learned, is there one of the four who you sort of became most partial to?
Well, they're all flawed individuals in some way. I liked Sam's narrative arc a lot. I mean, he's a soldier. He gets left at and so he's involved in the Mexican-American War and kind of falls in love with Mexico. He gets left behind to run a military way station, and they forget about him. He grows his hair out, hangs out with the locals, and he figures if I even desert it, no one would notice. He doesn't desert, but he thinks about it, right? And so eventually he decides he's going to stay in Mexico, and he sort of like sees himself as this bridge between cultures. It doesn't work out so well for him in Chihuahua because Roy screws it up for him. And then later he's in New Mexico and doing really well for himself. And then the Civil War upends him from there. So his dreams of being that bridge sort of fall afoul of war and politics and the rest of it. But I like that part of it, and his difference between him and Roy, which is the starkest of all of them, it is very narratively satisfying. But James is like the hidden gem. Researching famous people, and Sam Bean in his own way, especially at the time, was famous, right? And James Bean had a certain amount of celebrity to him as well. But talk about a sixth tier frontier celebrity. I mean, he's Independence, Missouri, which is hardly the frontier. It's the gateway to the frontier. And he went down the Santa Fe Trail and got in some trouble and gotten some gunplay with some Native Americans and all this and that. But, which is kind of standard for the time. But it's cool that he did that, right? That's interesting. But he's got terrible luck. And he gets involved in a marriage scandal. He gets involved in he's the guy to go to for an easy wedding, but he's also the first responder to violent crimes. So if there's a murder or suicide, he's the guy who goes out and makes the first assessment. He's what a justice of the peace should do, as opposed to what Roy does, which is a mockery of it, even by the standards of the time. So he's this dutiful sort of public servant, but he's and his end is pretty tragic as well. But even then, he exerts his influence enough so that I could find him, right? So no one cares about this guy, but I do, and tracing his path through life, a lot through census records and a lot through property records and slaveholding records, and then his own stuff that he wrote later in life when he was in the poor farm dying. That was gold, right? You can find something about Roy. Like I found Roy was involved in a court case with these two Confederate spy masters, they used to call them. But this is well after the Civil War, and the rumor and the truth is that Roy used to ride with these guys in New Mexico and was part of the spy ring and stealing horses from the Union. So he could, sell them, but so the cavalry couldn't get around. So he's softening them up for the Confederates to come in. So this guy Coopwood ran this sort of the spy ring. Roy Bean's not on his roster. He's like an unofficial kind of a, under the radar kind of a guy. Not a guy, kind of an agent. And so how do you prove? Well, this was proof that these guys all knew each other, right? So that to me was huge. Like that was a big deal. But finding James's final letters and finding out like what he did when he was in the poor farm and his thoughts on life and it was a way bigger deal for me. Because there's no reason that should be there except that I'd be looking, It was just left right there, it's just his final, I was here, this is what happened to me, this is how I spent the remaining couple of years of my life, and I'm a pathetic figure, but this is it. I'm still, it's just like this individualistic, he was organizing a library at the poor farm, so people had something to read. And it was like, he reached out to all of his old, and I knew it was him, he reached out to all the contacts, to all the people in his life that were still alive and were doing well, and they responded in all the different places as far as Kentucky. So, I mean, he really put that Bean effort into it, made sure it got into the newspapers in Kansas City and Independence. And so that I'd find it. I mean, he was still a Bean after all the lousy shit that happened to him. He still had whatever that spark is that makes all four of them interesting. He still had it. So that was validating in ways that from a personal standpoint meant more than any of the other things I was able to dig out.
That's exciting. That's like discovery. And you also, because there's the Bean family continues, right?
They're still bouncing around there. I did not speak to them.
Okay.
I read some articles. I hadn't seen an article from them in a long time, honestly. And I thought they didn't seem too enthusiastic about it, even at the time. And some of these were from like the 80s and 90s. And unless you've got that trunk, of artifacts or memorabilia or family stories that really make a difference, that you have that one or two, person connection. My grandmother told me this, and, there's so much of that with Roy. And so, and the other ones were so spread around that the value didn't seem worth the stretch, bothering people for it, and none of them have reached out since either. So I don't think there's a big affinity. The last thing I saw was in the early 90s, and the gist of the article was we don't know much about him. Every once in a while he gets brought up, and where I live is, his mixed reputation is not so great. And they were in like North Carolina or something. They weren't, so there was no huge tie. I did look at a couple of generations down the line just to see what was going on. Well, hey, there's a historian in the family, or hey, here's a great family tree, but I didn't find anything like that led me towards that. I usually do. But sometimes you're going back so far in time that it's not as useful, If I'm covering something about Vietnam, I'm always going to do it. Or even World War II, I do it. Inferno with the materials that I found in the guy's trunk that his son kept was and his son's involvement, and then the rest of his family, his wife's family as well in England, talking to me. I mean, all of that was extremely necessary, but it's not always as necessary, and it doesn't always yield as much, you know. And I think that's just time. You know, they hear the same stories we do. They read the same stuff I do. You know, unless they're deep into it and they don't have a primary source type relationship, it usually doesn't pay off too well. If not, I mean, Roy has a museum based on his, you know, for his stuff. So
with like the descriptions of Roy Bean, and like the biographies, how much did those biographers include the story of the three brothers?
they do a fair bit about Sam. They kind of gloss over Joshua and they ignore James. Is usually how it goes. And there's actually there's good reasons for all of that in terms of if you're focusing on the highlights of Roy, and his time in Langtree, that is just the background material and you go through it. But they definitely include his relationship with Sam and the falling out. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And they will mention things that I by necessity have to dwell on, like, oh well, he was involved as a scout with the Confederacy and was said he was involved in the Coopwood spy ring. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. He's what now? Like, all right, stop everything, roll back. Who's here? What's going on? How did it happen? All right, he was in Apache Pass. He knew the the militia guys from there. Okay, that's how he fell into it. I get all right. And now but when you take it slow and you take it from the character level, you gotta see where those connections are and what's true and what isn't. And their record is good. The previous Roy Bean, not all of them, but the ones that I rely on, the newer ones especially, are good biographies. One of them in particular has a lot of memories from Langtree of people remembering things about, and that's first hand. I mean, they're just a lot. It's not a Q&A book, but they're big chunks of just so and so said this, and that's a great gift. One book to another, and so that was it. I mean, they're all scattered in different areas and in different books, and you can paint that picture using some of the different bits and pieces that were given. And these are people that are long dead, so you're never going to get it back again, you know, and their families are gone. Langtree is very much a ghost town. So, I mean, I went there. There's no one to talk to. So James gets ignored. They didn't think he did anything historically worthy. And the Joshua stuff out in California, I guess most of the problem is going to California and doing the research, right? The things I'm able to do in a database and look at all the articles that were written about his incident, the duels and the shootings that they didn't know about, and, you know, finding the advertisements for him reopening the bar after his, spoiler alert, after his brother dies violently. He opens the bar and you can see that Roy Bean's bar is open and there's misspellings in it. I mean, that there's these little things that they didn't have that I'm able to include, but the bare bones are there. It's just that the focus is completely shifted from Roy did this, and there's a couple of pages about it, 5 pages, and I'm, 55, 60 pages in talking about the different political, ramifications, They didn't focus on Joshua as a politician, what he was fighting about, as a militia leader, what he did as a militia leader. So that's where I second and third tier it. They'll mention it, but they don't describe it. So they left meat on the bone, but they didn't have to put that meat on the bone because they were just, that's where Roy was, and Roy was with Joshua, and then this happens. And he's dead right before you even know it. Joshua's out of the picture, and you don't have any time to talk about any of the interesting stuff that he did or what happened to him or his role in the Mexican-American War. Even the wartime service of all these guys is never really taken in a narrative way at all. They don't, where was he in the line? Where was the unit? Where did he get sick? When did he go back? None of that ever gets covered, and that's the stuff I'm good at. So you stick to your strengths and then you just confirm what they had dug up and make sure that books aren't totally full of it. And these weren't. And some books are very old. I mean, Horace Bell wrote a book, and he met Roy Bean on several occasions, including in California. He's a witness to all sorts of interesting things. So some of the books that you rely on are as old as your characters, and those are the ones that you really like, the witness type stuff. But I don't sneer at the work of people who came before.